Now we want to discuss the impact of those top political moments on the future of President Biden's legislative agenda and ultimately the midterm elections. And to break it all down for us, I want to bring in Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne. Leslie is a CBS News political contributor and Republican strategist, and Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Guys, Happy New Year to the both of you. Let's start here with you, Joel. I have a question. President Biden started this year with a 53% approval rating, and now it's down to about a 43% approval rating. What do you think led to that? What moment do you think throughout the year sort of entered this shift in this downward direction for the president?
Well, it feels like a million years ago, but it all goes back about 6 months ago. If you remember, it was over the summer, around the 4th of July, the president declared independence from COVID, and he was riding high about that point. That was kind of the high watermark of his presidency and his popularity. And then a series of unscheduled things happened. The Delta variant, what happened in Afghanistan, all of the foibles there, consumer prices rising, all of the minutia and mess of the reconciliation package related to infrastructure and to Build Back Better. All of that came into public view. So it was when the president and his team were able to plan for all the on-schedule things, they did a really great, strong job of managing government. Is when those off-schedule things started happening that they really started to have problems. And by the way, that happens to every presidency. I do think the president and his team have recovered a bit. But if you draw back to where the problems began for the president, it's really at that point where the off-schedule political events started to take control of the news cycle.
And Leslie, when you start to pay attention to what's happening in the current state of things happening here in Washington, do you think the president bounces back from that? Does he recover from that 43%, perhaps to get it back to maybe 50, 51%?
I think you raised a really important area that doesn't get a lot of talk, a lot of discussion. And when you're talking about the president's approval rating and that inversion, and Joel is exactly right. It started this summer. I would say that you could really see the impact of a failed COVID strategy starting in September. From September on, the president has had over 50% disapproval of the way he's running this country. And that number continues to uptick every week. What are the reasons? I would argue, again, and agree with respect to the atrocious withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was a moment in time where the entire country, regardless of how they felt about occupation and our ability to be there, saw what looked like such a horrendous style of management and execution, and the pain that it caused the 13 service members that we lost. That is an incredible dark spot on this nation's history, but it definitely impacts this president. So while the president ran on a COVID strategy, that is the mark I believe people will think about when they reflect on the style, the leadership, and whether the president's party deserves to be in power moving from 2022 to 2024.
And many may certainly consider that to be a black eye, but I think a lot of people right now are paying attention to the pandemic, particularly with the surging Omicron variant. We're now at a record in terms of the rates of infections a year after vaccines became widely available. Leslie, how do you think that the vaccine rollout worked in terms of the Biden administration's handling of it, and do you think they could have done any better?
You know, there was so much confusion about the vaccines, and it's fair to say that anybody in that leadership position was going to have a difficult time. The president ran on his COVID strategy of being able to get those shots in arms. We talked about the number of vaccines, but it was all of those missteps that came from that. There's been a long conversation about testing and the need to ramp up testing as you got into the holiday season, the winter season, and the president discounted those calls for alarm. He discounted any discussion about the variants, and it left a lot of people really frustrated. We already know we have pandemic fatigue, but when the public is not clear about the next step, get the booster, don't get the booster. You can enjoy time with friends with mask off. You can't have mask off. You have to quarantine for 14 days. Then it's 10 days. Now it's 5 days. Every day there seems to be another type of this message that leads to further confusion and further polarization, not only around the issue of vaccines, which should never be an issue that's polarized, but also about what the state should be doing and how individuals should be protecting their families. That's why there's so much that could have been done to make it clearer, to get the science behind it, and to get the state and the governors involved. That would have, I think, alleviated a lot of this pressure.
Joel, let's talk legislation. President Biden was able to pass with bipartisan support his $1 trillion infrastructure bill. However, his social and climate spending plan, which is being termed the Build Back Better plan, is still in limbo. We know of the back and forth between moderate Senator Joe Manchin out of West Virginia, between him and the White House. How do you expect that to factor into the upcoming midterms?
Listen, I think having a positive message to sell to the American people is critical, and it's obvious that the crown jewel of the president's domestic agenda is his Build Back Better bill that he wants to get through. It's going to be smaller in size and in scope, no doubt, based on what Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, and others have said about constraining the limitations of that bill. I guess what I would also say, though, if you're a Democrat, you do have to take a quick step back and a kind of a deep breath. We're at the precipice of President Biden lording over about $5 trillion in domestic spending, most of that on COVID, obviously, with the bill earlier this year. And then you look at the infrastructure bill that was just passed about 2 months ago, and now you're looking at somewhere between a $1 and $1.5 trillion Build Back Better bill. This is big investment into the country. It might not feel like the biggest of wins because it's not the win that every Democrat wanted and they felt like they were promised on the campaign trail, but it does represent progress. And I do think Democrats maybe need to use this holiday break to get over it, lick their wounds a little bit, and figure out how do you present a good face on what was I would say, a pretty productive year legislatively for the president.
Leslie, next week marks 1 year since the deadly attack on the U.S. Capitol. The House Select Committee investigating the assault has plans to be more public with their probe in 2022. So what do you make of their progress so far? And do you think this investigation changes anyone's mind about what happened that day?
That's the powerful question. There's not a lot of evidence that it's going to change people's mind. I think what the country has kind of come to an agreement, which is the positive side of again, that being another dark spot in American history and how it never should have happened. Unpacking that becomes very political. I think to resolve that, the agreement for more transparency is absolutely needed. Republicans want to make sure that it's a measured approach and have had a lot of questions and pushback in terms of the procedural elements of this. But at the end of this process, the question is, are we moving forward together? And I don't think we're going to be there, much to the frustration, I would say, of Republicans and Democrats.
So I want to leave a question with the both of you. Joel, I'll start with you. What is the most important issue as we head into the next year?
Wow, there's a lot of issues you could pick at. I think maybe just kind of going back a little bit to what Leslie was just talking about related to that January 6th moment. I think looking back at 2021, the biggest moment happened in January, and it was the Georgia runoffs leading into January 6th, and then also President Trump's second impeachment trial where Republicans refused to hold him accountable. So I would jump off of that and say that an issue that I'm looking at is how do Republicans manage President Trump in this environment? Donald Trump is the spiritual leader, the godfather, if you will, of the Republican Party. And I think they are going to have to wrestle with his legacy because he is the thing that juices and turns out their base, even if he is not the face they want to put on their party. And so I think looking towards 2022, carrying over from 21, that's a major issue. And
Leslie, how about you?
Major issue is going to continue to be COVID and the response to this, and whether it's going to continue to have an economic impact as it connects to the growth and the continued stability of the economy. So as families are looking at pocketbook issues, they're feeling the pinch around inflation. They're looking for a kind of resolution on the COVID crisis, some sort of leadership, and then what is going to be done to protect these families' pocketbooks and small business. And I don't know that you're seeing and hearing a lot about that right now, but these are the impacts that are really going to be critical looking ahead.
Certainly guaranteed to be a politically packed 2022. Leslie Sanchez, Joel Payne, thank you so much, and a Happy New Year to the both of you.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.